inshallah, our tafsir. And Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we actually have been doing Surah Nisa, and of course, we did actually cover a lot. To just go over really quick, we talked the different ayat that relate to tafsir. We talked about the ayat that relates to jihad. We went into lots of details in talking about jihad. We also talked about the munafiqeen, and we also talked about, of course, these ayat right there. إِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ فَتَبَيَّنُوا, and we talked about the stories that related to there, in where they were, I guess, taking their deen, let's say, not the way that the Prophet ﷺ had instructed them. So they started sometimes going into battle, and then they would basically find themselves across people that out of fear, they might actually say that they're Muslim. And of course, even though there is no compulsion in religion, so let's not confuse that one and think that that Islam was ordering them, if somebody's not Muslim, that you would just kill them. There's no compulsion in religion, but some, of course, were misunderstanding. And of course, just like the stereotypical images that we have today about Islam, we also had stereotypical images even at the time. And we talked about the Shahada, and whether the person that wants to embrace Islam, whether they have to do Shahada, or whether it was enough to say something like, I'm Muslim, or whether the person just says that they believe in Islam just as a general broad term, or whether they actually have to say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. So we went in details in that regards, and we also talked about Abdullah ibn Maktoum, and we said the story about when he heard the ayah revealed, لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين والمجاهدون, and he felt that, well, am I excluded here, that I won't be included in getting the reward for all of this, because the ayah was saying that those that are sitting down, that is, of course, sitting down here is not talking about literally sitting down. So this is actually to mean those that are not joining the army and not joining in combat. So that's what this one would be. This would be a metaphor and not a literal word. And of course, it's really important to remember that the part about the word sometimes literally used and sometimes metaphorically used, this is extremely important to keep in mind, especially if you want to learn the Quran. You always have to keep in mind whether this is actually a literal word or a metaphorical word. And metaphor, or at least the figurative terms in Lugha Arabiya, especially in the Quran, is very, very common. And the reason for that is the whole idea of separating between academia, or let me say literacy, and also the pragmatic way. This is actually a modern Western style. The Quran does not adopt this style whatsoever, and connecting between I guess the words, the pragmatic words, and even the metaphors, the figurative terms, the different literature, or even the different forms of speaking even to emotions, etc. This is actually a Quranic way, in a Arabi way. Right now, I would say, even in academia, they are trying to adopt. I'm talking about the academia in writing dissertations, in writing articles, and writing at least, academic articles, in writing thesis as well, in where they would expect you to be subjective, in where you're not going to be including emotions, the literal, or at least the figurative terms, or literature, and these kind of things. They're expecting you not to embed them within your writings. But of course, this is not whatsoever the way and the method that even in the books of fiqh they would use, or even in the books of tafsir, or even in the Quran. So this is really, I don't know where it's coming from. Really, would be really interesting to um, it's really interesting to actually go and see where this whole idea came from. Although it, they would introduce it and present it that it's a way to keep away all the different biases, all the different influences, and so forth. But that's not the Quranic way. The Quranic way does actually consider metaphor, does consider emotions, does consider all the different influences, that this is actually part of the argument, and this is not to be separated from the argument. So that's why you would see the Quran embedding a lot of emotions, a lot of metaphorical words, a lot of figurative words, etc., and even all the different types of figurative methods are also embedded right there. All right. So لا يستوي القاعدون من المؤمنين غير أولي الضرر. So the ones that are sitting down, and of course this is a metaphor, that are not joining in combat, they would not be equal to those that are engaging in jihad. And then later, or not later, so it was more of a short time lapse when this part and this piece of that ayah, غير أولي الضرر, was then revealed, and the Prophet ﷺ asked Zayd ibn Thabit to embed it within the ayah. Now, it's really important to keep in mind that the ayat were revealed munajjama, and what the word munajjama means, it has nothing to do with moons, it has nothing to do with stars. Munajjama actually means that they were in partitions that were separated partitions, in other words, at different time lapses. So you would have this piece of the ayah, for example, revealed, and then this was connected to it, and then probably minutes later, this part of the ayah was revealed, and the Prophet ﷺ would tell them to embed it within this ayah, within these words, within this surah, and so forth. And then, of course, it would be documented by who were called Kuttab al-Wahi. So Kuttab al-Wahi were basically a number of different Sahaba, and part of the Kuttab al-Wahi were number one, Ubay ibn Ka'b, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan, Zayd ibn Thabit. Those were some of the Kuttab al-Wahi. They're not limited to those Kuttab as the ones to write. And the word Kuttab al-Wahi, let me write that down for you. The word Kuttab al-Wahi, it's actually a compound word. Let me write that down. So Kuttab al-Wahi. So the word Kuttab actually means scribers, or the writers. Al-Wahi means revelation. So that they were designated to be the scribers of whatever was revealed. All right. And we talked about the different things that would happen to the Prophet ﷺ when the Quran was revealed, in other words, during revelation. And we talked about the misconception that it's related to the symptoms of epilepsy and all of that. And we basically just talked about all those different signs of epilepsy, and that what the Prophet ﷺ was going through has nothing to do with epilepsy, as he was aware, fully aware. He did not have any sort of or any type of seizure like symptoms. He was actually getting information and not losing information. So, unlike epilepsy, and certainly you would not actually see a person that looked confused or a person with eyeballs rolling or any of that. In fact, he was fully alert, and he was of course, yeah, doing and repeating those ayat right there. So غير أولي الضرر والمجاهدون في سبيل الله بأموالهم وأنفسهم. So في سبيل الله, of course, المجاهدون في سبيل الله, those that were doing jihad في سبيل الله. بأموالهم وأنفسهم. Of course, الجهاد is actually in different types. We talked about combat in person. We also talked about combat in contributing in بأموالهم وأنفسهم. Okay, وأنفسهم. Okay, so here's what happened, everybody. My husband asked me to do him a coffee, and I completely forgot and started my class. Yeah. Um,
It's okay. You can step out for a minute or
it's being recorded, so he's looking at me like, just happened. And I'm like, oops, oops. Yeah, even the sheikh can sometimes be bad, right?
I
I
mean,
forgot.
we're all human. We're all human.
I totally forgot. You know when your mind just goes blank? Oops.
It's the week after
Week after,
Eid.
exactly. It's not my fault. Exactly. It's
Yes.
Ramadan. It's the week after Ramadan. It's not my fault. Yeah, I know how to get away from it. Yeah, I gave myself the fatwa that it was okay, right? Sorry about that, everybody.
Do you need to go for a minute?
Continue, inshallah.
Oh, okay.
But it was caught on camera.
That's okay. Jazakallah khair.
All right. فضل الله Sorry, everybody. It was caught on camera that, my husband's looking at me all confused, and I'm like, and I'm looking at him like, what's wrong with you? Like I didn't do anything. And when your hands are, basically caught with all the paint, and you're like, what's wrong? All right. So فضل الله المجاهدين بأموالهم وأنفسهم على القاعدين درجة. And we talked about the different the different levels of course, doing good deeds. When we're talking about the different levels of good deeds, of course, it's not equal, but when a person has the intention, but they have a disability where they're not capable of doing it, let's talk about a couple disabilities that we didn't talk about before. So number one, the mental disability. And or of course, when we're speaking about mental disability, we're actually talking about that the person that's the highest level. Let's put that in categories to actually help us see it. Okay. So when we're talking about a mental disability, let's write it there. The mental disability. Okay. Mental disability, there are two types of mental disabilities. There's one that is basically in where مطبق and there's the one غير المطبق. So what does that mean? So the mental disability, المطبق, is basically a person that is absolutely and totally insane. So a person that is completely insane where they cannot relate to understanding the world around them. And of course, that would be a chronic one. That's al-mutbaq. غير المطبق is when a person goes through lapses of a mental disability. And it could be two kinds. It could be a lapse where it's a momentarily thing. So it happens maybe a couple days, a few weeks later, they're fine. And then other days they're getting into these flares. It can happen. Of course, we know that medications do actually help, but that's a different story. And غير المطبق could also be not necessarily so. It could be a chronic disability, but it's considered as part of غير المطبق. But this person is not fully aware. So if you were to basically do an exam, they'll tell you that their IQ is definitely lower than the age, or at least where they're supposed to be at. Right. So that would be considered غير المطبق. And of course, when we're speaking about their IQ, or we're talking about cognitive disabilities, or we're talking about even social disabilities, it differs from one person to another. Not always can the psychiatrists or psychologists really know how much does that person really know. And especially if we're talking about different mental disabilities, how aware are they of the world around them? We don't fully know all the time. And especially if we're talking about غير مطبق, especially about those that would get different flares. And we know that there had been some cases where certain people had been able to fake disabilities as well in order to get away with certain assaults, or certain or probably even get certain privileges, but that's rare. So we cannot assume that every single person that is mentally disabled, or at least appearing as mentally disabled, that they're necessarily faking it. We would have to assume that in the situations where the specialist would tell me that this person is actually going through a disability, we would have to accept that they're going through a disability. So the question that comes up is, well, how accountable are they for their salah, for their talaq, for the different responsibilities that they should be doing? How responsible are they? So we cannot always answer those questions. It can be a case by case situation, but in general, there is something I want you to actually look at this word, which is il'ata. Il'ata it's a mental disability. Now, previously, the fuqaha didn't actually have, I would say, the training or the knowledge that they have today in regards to mental illnesses. So they had general classifications of somebody that had a chronic or a complete mental disability, or somebody that had a temporary or at least uh, lapses of disability or mental disability. But they also had something just like العادة, in where they were capable of putting in certain classifications. And of course, later and even right now, we can include such mental disabilities within these categories. So العادة would be a person can speak. It's more related to speech. In They were capable of recognizing that certain people can actually have, let's call it, speech where that reveals that the person is fully aware. And at other times, you could see that their speech is revealing some form of a cognitive disability or a social disability, or some form of, let's say, disability where they're not fully aware of the different things of reality that happens around them. So that's al-ata. So it was more related to speech, but that's not necessarily just to speech, because they were capable of, let's say, diagnosing and recognizing that the speech was showing that there is a mental disorder, but they didn't necessarily understand or classify it as ADHD or autism or perhaps a bipolar. They didn't associate it with these classifications that we have today. All right. So this is really important to just keep in mind, in where, although, yes, they didn't necessarily have these classifications, but there are these broad classifications that they did have, in where a person with a mental disability is basically not held accountable for certain behaviors. And that's where, if we're speaking about certain, let's call it, pragmatic behaviors, pragmatic applications, things that relate to probably a responsibility in where people's rights are involved. So when it comes to people's rights involved, that's when we would see that if a person has, whether it is junun mutbiq, a complete mental disability, or whether this is temporary or at least flares disability, in that situation, there would be a wali. I want to look at this one because this is really important to keep in mind, because il-wali, I'm going to write it right there. Il-wali is basically the guardian, and the guardian would be the person that would be in charge of making those decisions on behalf of this person that has a disability. And this is really important. So even if this disabled person had told his wife that she is divorced, that divorce does not actually take place. It would only be taking place if it was approved by the wali, and not necessarily just by the wali. And of course, then we would take as well the qadi, who would basically affirm that that this, let's say, action done by the guardian on whether it is for the interest of this disabled person. So then we would actually have these stages of number one, yes, we would have the wali, but then if this person, disabled person, or if someone else brought it to court that the wali was acting on a behalf of himself and not necessarily the interest of whoever he's a guardian over, then in that situation there would be a guardian ad litem, or there would be the qadi who would foresee to make sure that what the wali is doing in favor and in interest of is really the person that he's guardian right now. And of course it would be, let's call it a more scrutinized guardianship when it is not the parent. It would be scrutinized by, of course, a certain area that would be specialized in making sure that this guardian is acting on behalf of the interest of the person that he's taking or they're taking care of. So the wali can be a wali on behalf of a male or a female. It doesn't have to be a female. It could also be on behalf of a male that is going through some form of disability. And we're talking about here mental disability that is غير مطبق. As for the religious, let's call it the religious segment, in where is that person held accountable religiously, let's say for their ghusl, for their salah, for their hijab, etc. So if the person is in the situation of mutbaq, a complete mental disability, the answer is no. They're not held accountable for their behavior, not for their hijab, not for their salah, not for their tahara. So who is? So if we're talking about the guardians, okay, now they're the guardian is of course responsible for the relationship between them or that person, that disabled person, and the other people's rights. In that situation, of course, that's where they would be limited to. But in terms of the religious segment of it, the guardian does not do anything on their behalf, at least in terms of the religious segment of it. So in other words, no need to pray on their behalf, and no need to pay fidya for not fasting during Ramadan on their behalf. But if it comes to zakat, let's say this person inherited $1 million, and although mentally disabled, but they still inherited $1 million. All right. Does that person or the guardian, do they pay zakat on behalf of the $1 million, even though it belongs to a person that is mentally disabled? The answer, according to the majority of the scholars, not all, the majority of the scholars considered that yes, they would pay zakat on behalf of this mentally disabled person, even though they're not held accountable. Some scholars, they regarded that no, they would not pay zakat on their behalf, because in order to pay zakat, that you actually had to be baligh aqil, in other words, fully mentally aware. And basically that person not being aware, then in that situation there is no intention, and therefore it makes no sense to deduct zakat on their behalf when they're not even aware of what is happening. The other scholars that regarded that yes, you still pay zakat, which is the preponderant ruling, you would still pay zakat on behalf of their money, because the money that is within the ummah is basically money that is there, and therefore the need, and just as we are spending this money for, of course, the interest of this ill person or even the community, the money cannot be just basically quarantined or frozen in a bank. It must be something that is invested, and if it's money that is invested, it is considered money within the community that should be not only invested, but should also be used not only for the person that is ill, but if there is an amount of zakat zakat to be deducted, then in that situation, we should, and we must actually use that money in order to bring about of course, the shelter, the cover the needs for those that are poor within the community, if this person has the nisab for it. Now, when we're speaking about il-wali, of course, there are all these different areas. How much of a wali, how much of not how much of a wali, but how much of power does the wali have? That would really depend on the case, and even if it's a woman, that would still depend on the case. And just as we would look at the wali, even if he is the wali in a case of marriage, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَعْضُلُهُنَّ إِن يَنكِحْنَ أَزْوَاجَهُنَّ إِنْ أَرَدْنَا تَحَصُّنًا. There Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually prohibited the wali from preventing his basically daughter or sister from going back to their husbands if they wanted to go back. And even though the wali might see that it is not for your interest, it's not bringing you any good, don't go back to your husband, this person is abusive, etc., but she chooses to still go back, the wali doesn't have the right to say, well, I'm the wali and makes the decisions on behalf of your marriage, and I'm the one that's here making the commands and making the orders. So in that situation, we would say, sorry, but you're acting outside of your jurisdiction. You don't have the right to act in this situation and prevent the girl, whether it's your sister or whether it's your daughter, from going back to her husband if she chooses to do so. And I would like to say that at many times we may actually find ourselves encouraging other women to engage and even go into a divorce, thinking that we're here acting as counselors, or we're just basically trying to encourage this woman to be free. I would like to say, be careful from that, because the Prophet ﷺ had actually said, مَلْعُونٌ مَنْ خَبَّبَ امْرَأَةً عَلَى زَوْجِهَا. The person that encourages a woman, or at least somehow plays the game, or even if they think, well, I'm not here playing a game, I'm here just trying to encourage the woman to what is better for her, and encourage her to divorce her husband or to leave her the marriage or whatever it is, that person is mal'un, that person is cursed. So be careful from that, thinking that you're basically just trying to do the right thing, without you recognizing that you could actually be included within a which is trying to let the woman go against her husband. And it's really common, and I mean very, very
Yeah,
common,
you hear that all in
all
like
the
Facebook groups and all that stuff. I mean, that's
absolutely,
very
and they
scary.
don't exactly, and it's extremely sad that you could see that somebody is giving this advice, yeah, leave them, just etc., and it's like, wait a minute, do you not recognize here that you are destroying a whole marriage? And it's really sad that we're seeing this narcissist claim just really at hand, and everybody all of a sudden just, all of a sudden becomes the expert, in where they're ready. Yes, this is a narcissist, that's a narcissist, and everybody becomes all of a sudden the expert and the specialist to pass on all these diagnoses on people, and where, yeah, that person is a narcissist, therefore there's no treatment, just leave that person and just move on. And right now, especially on social media, it's so easy for people to basically act as the experts. And even if a person is a therapist, it's really important to keep in mind that even if you are a therapist, you cannot diagnose a person that you did not actually see in person, and of course a person that you didn't even have conversations with. So it makes no sense to actually diagnose a person when they're not actually present. And it's really, really common to hear one side of the story and really confuse and think that by hearing one side of the story that you've got all the picture. And when you really hear both sides of the story, you'll be really surprised the story is completely different than what person A was saying, or even what person B was saying. You really have to have both parties sit together, hear one another, hear the claim, and take the time to hear the story and be careful from a lot of those narratives that can be put forward by this side or even that side. Some people are real con artists in making their side of the story, or let me call it as well, they know how to advocate for themselves, and the other person just probably just doesn't know how to advocate for themselves. And here's one thing to keep in mind: a person that is torn or going through trauma, at many times they had been completely depleted, that they just didn't know how to defend themselves. So not because a person didn't know how to make a clear statement or a clear, let me say, wordings to advocate for themselves, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are the ones that are fully wrong. Some people, they just have been totally depleted, totally in complete trauma, incomplete, uh, I guess in that situation where they just completely lost their ability to defend themselves. They lost their ability to be able to even make full statements or even understand what happened. They they completely became clueless, and they just don't know how to speak on their behalf. And in that situation, it's really important to understand, even if you are involved in any marital disagreement, take the time to recognize that even if you hear both parties talking, you can make your own judgment, and you can think that, oh, I know exactly what happened, she's at fault, etc. But you always have to remember that the Prophet himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, had actually said, I'm a human being and I judge based on what I hear. In other words, hearing what everybody laying out their statements. And if you have been given or at least granted, let's say, the trial, you won the case as to what it appears to you, and you know that you had abused the other person and abused their right, then know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take it from you. And this is really important to keep in mind, that if the Prophet himself sallallahu had said that I can judge based on what I hear and not necessarily be fully accurate in me assessing the situation. And this is a prophet. Now, that's the same thing that you always need to keep in mind, not because you assess the situation in a certain way that you would necessarily want to guarantee that you fully know what's going on. That person is just the cruel person, etc. Sometimes it can happen that you can have two sides that are actually good in their deen, and two sides that are actually trying to be their best. But then sometimes it can happen that people can interpret other people's intentions. And most problems are really as a result of us interpreting and wrong interpretation for somebody's intention. So be careful with that. Just wanted to mention that one in terms of the wali. What about the other type of disabilities? So we're talking about the physical disabilities. This is going to be a disability, uh, you know, based on the case by case disability. So if we're talking about disability, of course, in where disables the person from doing a certain action, let's say going to jihad, not capable of running, not capable of, maybe, let's say, amputated, or in that situation, then that's a different story. in relationship to people's rights, it's important to keep in mind that a disability will be taken, let's I guess say will be taken in consideration. Just as when we're talking about a mental disability, when it relates to people's rights, it would still be taken consideration. But when it relates to people's rights, so let's just assume, going back to mental disability, I know I jumped back, sorry about that, forgot to mention this point. Let's just assume a person that has Down syndrome, all right? They were playing ball and they basically kicked the ball and broke somebody's window, okay? In that situation, do we say, though they're not held accountable because they're mentally disabled, etc.? The answer is no. If this is causing harm to people's properties, if this is causing harm, then in that situation, the wali is going to be responsible. The wali is going to be responsible to basically compensate whatever damage had been done as a result of the person that had, whether it's a chronic or whether it's a temporary a mental disability, then in that situation, we cannot just say, well, this person is not held accountable and just let them roaming around like that. Well, that's what you're going to be a wali for. You're basically going to compensate because you were supposed to make sure that the other people are actually safe from the harm, whether it was intentional or whether it is unintentional harm, that the person and the rest of the community is basically going to be safe. Now, going back, sorry, I just forgot to mention that point. The other types of disabilities are going to be case by case. So if we're talking about, let's say in marriage, if let's say a sister says that that her husband, let's just assume, has erectile dysfunction, etc., then it's a case by case. And then in that situation, we would basically have specialists get involved in order to basically help us assess the situation. Are we really seeing a disability here? Is this chronic? Can it be cured? Is she claiming something? And of course, having right now the specialist get involved is extremely important, because before in the books of fiqh, you will have a lot of the scholars will say, well, we'll make them make the oath, say the qasam, in order to determine whether the person is disabled or not, etc. But of course, right now we have the specialists that can actually make their reports and sayings in order to make the final statement. And of course, it's going to reduce the number of times that we would just say, well, let's make the qasam, let's ask her to say wallahi. We always depended a lot of times on the person's witness and in assessing the person's, I guess, credibility. And because we didn't have the specialists advanced in their knowledge and in, of course, the tools that we have today. So having those areas of specialties is extremely important. So how did we get there? فضل الله المجاهدين بأموالهم وأنفسهم على القاعدين درجة. It was supposed to be about jihad, but then it's important, when we're speaking about, yes, that the mujahideen, those that would put in jihad, invest with their money, invest, of course, in combat with their life being at stake, are basically at a higher level than those that are not involved in contributing in their wealth or with their wealth or even in their life, and they would be at a better place, that is those that are involved in person or even in wealth. They would be of course at a higher level. And we talked about that we talked about the different levels of different behaviors, or the different levels that not only in jihad but also in different contribution. In other words, it depends really if the person has the intention, the sincerity, and even if they're not capable of really contributing themselves, but they had the intention but not the tools to actually invest, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically here emphasizing that even if the person just had the intention, they didn't have the tools to contribute, not their own life and even not their own wealth, but they really wanted to invest within, let's say, jihad or invest in a good cause, that they would basically be given the reward for the intention. So this is extremely important to keep in mind. We talked about it in detail last time. وَكُلَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised all al-husna, and we said al-husna, we said there are two types of al, which is the particular al-ahdiyah, and of course the inclusive al, or the generalizing al, which basically is a defining article, which basically would include every single noun, or every single item that is included within this noun. The al only goes on the nouns and does not go on a verb, so just to keep that in mind. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says wa kullan, and each, so whether we're talking about the person that is really involved in combat, in their own financial investment, or whether they were involved in combat, in other words, putting their life at stake in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكُلَّ وَعْدَ اللَّهُ الْحُسْنَى, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had promised all al-husna, whether al-husna is to mean Jannah, or whether al-husna is to mean victory, or whether al-husna to mean a reward, a status in the akhirah. At the end, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had emphasized again that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had preferred those that are involved in the actual behavior in combat or investment in wealth as at a higher level than those that basically just had the intention. We also went into al-maghfirah and al-rahmah. Of course, al-maghfirah is different than al-rahmah, because al-maghfirah would basically mean that the sin is basically removed, or at least that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had removed the implication of the sin. I want you to look at this one, because the word dhanb actually comes as well and shares a root, dhanaba or dhanab. The word dhanab means a tail, but the word dhanb, which really shares the same root, means sin. And you might ask, well, what does a tail have in common with a sin? So in Arabic, you can actually have these common etymologies at many times, because of how they perceive that sin itself can be attached to the person and can, one, make the person lose balance. Two, it can also be something that would come always after them. In other words, the sin will be something that basically is tracing a lot of the different implications that you would be involved in. It's really interesting how, it comes back to you. So the dhanab, the tail, the sin that you might commit would always be behind you, tracing you. It would always be what would bring about the implications of your future. So in other words, just if you think that it was a sin I committed long time ago, and it's the end of it, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling you, well, just when you thought it was an unforgotten thing or an unforgotten sin, it can be something that will come back to you later on, and really as a result of a sin that you had committed many years back, or a couple months back, or whatever. So that's why we would make the dua that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not hold us accountable, not only in the hereafter, but even in this life, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would not hold us accountable. In other words, would not let the implication of sin actually come back to us. The implication of sin, it could be implication, psychological implication, it could be physical implication, it could be financial implication, it could be a social implication. Without you realizing, it could actually be it could actually be as a result without you recognizing, well, why am I doing this? But it doesn't mean that every single harm that you would come across is really a result of a sin that you had committed. It doesn't mean that. Because remember, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Nabluwakum bisharri wal khayri fitna, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can inflict and I want you to look at the word nabluwakum, because nabluwakum actually means inflict. Let me write that down and help you actually see it, okay? Nabluwakum, nabluwakum bisharri wal khayri fitna. All right, now here's the thing. Nabluwakum actually means inflict, bishar with evil, and good, fitna, as fitna. So some scholars understood nabluwakum bishar to inflict evil on you in order to test you, and khair is therefore a fitna. And other scholars read it as, well, this basically means both evil and good are inflicted to cause fitna. The word fitna actually means a test. So some scholars understood that evil is basically the ibtila, the inflicted pain, and khair is fitna, is a trial. It's basically a place where it can cause a delusion, can be making you more vulnerable and susceptible to basically committing different delusions and going into an area of fitna, and where you're more susceptible whenever you are to have any good things that probably that you might be getting, whether it's health, wealth, whatever it is, that it can be, let's call it a slippery slope that can lead to a delusion and a fitna without you realizing. So that's the first interpretation, that khair is fitna and shar is an ibtila. It's an infliction. It's basically that moment where you might not realize that it's actually coming at you. The other scholars that read it as nabluwakum bisharri wal khayri fitna, they said, no, both the evil and the good are basically a fitna, and therefore even good is an ibtila. Even good is basically something that you're inflicted with. So you could have a lot of money, but just when you thought that the money was a privilege, it could be that it was actually an ibtila. That's really scary. That is really scary. You might see privileges as, with this interpretation, you might see that the privileges are really good, but that's a narrative, and you might actually not be aware that the money, the freedom that you actually got, or the intelligence was actually nothing but something that you were actually tested with. In other words, it was not actually good for you. And on the other hand, that sometimes the pain that you're going through in itself is actually the blessing. You're reading the ayah that you might actually be going through poverty, but just as we read that il khair can be an ibtila, il khair, the good things that you might have, can actually be an infliction. That the same thing, that what you see that some people are probably losing a daughter or losing a son or losing a husband, you might see it as that was really an evil thing, but it could actually be the blessing without you realizing. And that's
Wait,
why,
did you just say that intelligence can be an ibtila?
oh yes, ma'am, intelligence can be an ibtila. You'll be so surprised. A lot of those that are in prison are extremely intelligent. So if your intelligence, you're using it for the wrong thing, yes, it can be an ibtila. Every
Oh, okay.
single,
Now I understand.
absolutely. So a person can be, let's say, a doctor, an engineer, but they're using that. I mean, remember What is right now Bill Gates actually doing? I mean, TED Talk. I mean, he's like, hey, we basically need to reduce the number of people by this much percentage. It's
Oh,
You
yeah.
see what I'm saying? Is
SubhanAllah.
this guy
Yeah.
smart? Well, you cannot debate that he's not smart, right? So here it is. Same thing with Stephen Hawking's, for example. Were these people smart? Well, you better believe that they were smart. They basically did all these different studies, did all these different, math problems and all of those. And yeah, absolutely they were smart. But that intelligence had actually gotten them stupider. They were using it for something that is not ethical. They were using it to basically get them into a delusion. So when you look at, for example, you're talking about Stephen Hawking, it's like, look at you. You couldn't even see with your intelligence the magnificence of the Lord Almighty. So his intelligence got him into really a type of delusion. So it's not always as easy as just saying, oh, it's a privilege. Well, it depends on how it's being used. Same thing with money. You can say, oh, I thought, why would you say that it's not a privilege? Oh, it can be a privilege, and it can be an infliction. It can be an infliction if you're using the money for the wrong cause. You can use your intelligence for the wrong cause. You can use your beauty for the wrong cause. You can use your eloquence for the wrong cause. Some people, they're just really eloquent. Con artists, they just
So
know
it's
how to use their
so
words.
it's basically the ni'mah that you have, the blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you or didn't give you, could be an ibtila, right? Is
Well,
that
so
sorry, I'll be
basically,
quiet.
in order to classify whether this is an ibtila or whether it was good, it basically is dependent on how you embrace it. So whether that was, let's let's look at somebody with an ibtila first. Maybe it's easier to say. Let's say a woman, her son died. Okay, that moment when this woman, her son died, all we could see through it is nothing but an evil thing. It's nothing but pain and nothing but that there's no gain in it. But that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually says, look at the ayah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that when you look at the ayah, what is the ayah? وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف والجوع ونقص من الأموال والأنفس والثمرات وبشر الصابرين. Look at the ayah. And we will inflict you. Look at the word. نبلوكم ولنبلونكم بشيء. We will basically inflict you with some, not fully, with some of the reduction. نبلوكم بشيء ولنبلونكم بشيء من الخوف, with fear, نقص من الأموال, reduction of wealth, الأنفس, lives. You might lose a daughter, son, etc. الأنفس والثمرات. الثمرات basically fruits, which basically here is a metaphor. All the different produce, all the different foods, all the different things that you might actually have. All right, but the ayah actually says وبشر الصابرين. Bashir actually is a word to mean congratulate. Well, wait a minute. Is this tahakkum here? Absolutely, it's not tahakkum. What is tahakkum? Tahakkum is basically a word that is being sarcastic, but this is not being sarcastic. Bashir al-Sabirin, no, it's actually telling you that it's all dependent and determined on the way you embrace it. If you embrace the different inflictions of pain in a way that is to bring you glad tidings in the akhirah, then in that situation, that pain was actually a gain. It's all dependent on how you embraced it. That pain was a gain. How
Jazakallah
is it a
khair.
gain? It was a gain because although you didn't see the gain in this life, certainly your son didn't come back to life. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was wanting to compensate you and reward you for the pain that you lost, the temporary pain. And that's why the ayah says, be shay'in. It's just temporary, it's just a small amount, because it is to reduce a bigger infliction of pain in the hereafter. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the ayah was basically telling us about in Surah Al-Insan, Inna ha'ula, what about them? يذرون وراءهم يوما ثقيلا. They leave behind a day that is loaded with infliction, loaded with pain, loaded with so much burden on them. What about them? نحن خلقناهم وشددنا أسرهم وإذا شئنا بدلنا أمثالهم تبديلا. What about them? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, He created them. He knows what people are. What about them? They're basically يذرون وراءهم يوما ثقيلا. They're leaving. Now that's the real pain. So when you look at وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ, it's all about how you perceive the different things. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was basically telling you, well, even if you saw the privileges of probably gain as money, as probably intelligence, as probably privileges that you might get, a job, whatever it is, a position, a status, all of that, you might see it as gain, but it wouldn't actually be gain unless you had actually used it for the right purpose. That's when it would actually be a gain. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was telling you that the real gain is not in what you accumulate and what you gather in this life. Because this could be something that you would carry on Judgment Day. What does that mean? So you could be, for example, you were a doctor, and this doctor had a lot of patients, did a lot of money, etc. Remember that guy that was a doctor that basically had diagnosed so many people with cancer? In over 15,000 people, he diagnosed with cancer when in reality, they didn't actually have cancer. I think it was in Michigan. They didn't actually have cancer, but what he wanted was he diagnosed them with cancer in order to basically get long-term customers, patients to continue doing the chemotherapy, radiation, all of that stuff in order to basically continue more money coming in. So what happened? He basically used his intelligence. Did he have the intelligence to actually pass the oncology programs and medical programs? Oh, he definitely passed all of that. That's why he was actually a certified fellowship. He had the certified fellowship. He was a certified fellow. He had basically the residency, went through all of that, went through all those different accreditations, but he used it for the wrong thing. This was right there. Use his intelligence. Was he smart? Well, absolutely, he was smart, but he used it for the wrong thing. He was literally killing people. There it is. So, yes, if you would get a privilege, if it's not used for the right thing, then in that situation, it basically would be wabal. What is al-wabal? Wabal would be a burden that the person would carry on themselves. And of course, in that situation, it's all about really the implications of what you do is basically going to determine whether that was good or whether that was not good. That is the privilege, quote unquote, that you have. What are you using it for? Is it in going in congruence with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had regarded as basically the principle for it, or what was it used for? إن الذين توفاهم الملائكة ظالمي أنفسهم قالوا فيما كنتم قالوا كنا مستضعفين في الأرض قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها. And we talked about this ayah right there, those that basically توفاهم الملائكة. We talked about الملائكة, and this is right there. It basically answers a lot of questions that people would tell me. Is it one angel that's taking away the souls of people, or is it more than one angel? Is it one angel present? Is it more than one angel, etc.? At the end of the day, you could see this ayah right there. توفاهم الملائكة. The malaika, there's more than one angel that is responsible for removing, or at least taking out the soul of the person when they die. نسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى الرحمة ونسأل الله سبحانه وتعالى حسن الخاتمة. Ya Allah, grant us the mercy and grant us حسن الخاتمة, where the last words and the last actions be actions
Ameen.
that would get us closer to Jannah. Allahumma ameen. There would be actions and word that would get us closer to Jannah. Allahumma ameen. Ya Allah, you know the Sahaba, they used to be afraid of one hadith. This hadith was haunting everybody, where the Prophet ﷺ actually said, إن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل الجنة حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيعمل بعمل أهل النار فيدخلها. And he said, and إن أحدكم ليعمل بعمل أهل النار فيما يبدو للناس and حتى ما يكون بينه وبينها إلا ذراع فيسبق عليه الكتاب فيدخلها. فيعمل بعمل أهل الجنة فيدخلها. This hadith, what it means is that some of you might actually do the actions of the people of Ahlul Jannah, to the point that there is no distance between you and Jannah except the distance of an arm reach. This close to Jannah, arm reach. You're right to be there. And then فيسبق عليه الكتاب. يسبق عليه الكتاب. What Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had decreed basically is then coming onto the surface. What does that mean? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one responsible to actually make me change? No. It's that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had known the person's intentions. That's why the other hadith says, فِيمَا يَبْدُ لِلنَّاسِ, as to what appears to people. In other words, the reality of a person's intentions on the inside had actually come to the surface. And that is what is going to determine the ending of a person. And at the same time,
So that means that like we should always do tazkiyah, right? And
we should always do
always look
tazkiyah.
at our niyyah, and right?
Absolutely, we should always do tazkiyah, because you can be so happy about yourself. Hey, I'm doing this and I'm donating this much, I'm giving da'wah, I'm doing all of that, but you never know. You never know. It could happen that it can come to the surface where you didn't do the tazkiyah, would come to the surface and actually really reveal another person that that person was concealing. That's why we would always make the dua. Ya Allah, make the inside of us better than the outside. Even when somebody praises you, the sunnah is to say, Ya Allah, make my inside better than what people would praise me for, better than the outside. Because when people praise you, they had only praised what they know about you. They only praise what they know about you, and not necessarily what you would do in private, not necessarily. And that's why it's really important to make that dua. Ya Allah, make our inside better than our outside. This is very important. Make our inside be better than the outside. And there are those that you would judge as she's a bad Muslim or he's a bad Muslim. It could be that they're doing a couple sins, but on the inside, they could actually have better taqwa, better deen than what you might actually think of them as. And that's why it's important to take that moment to remember that somebody can be doing a sin to what appears to you as a sin. But the truth of the matter is that they were actually doing khair. It's Ya Allah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just give us husn al-khatimah. I don't want to go, in and jump into a different world. قالوا ألم تكن أرض الله واسعة فتهاجروا فيها. Then they would say, of course, who's that? Basically the malaika. When they would reprimand them, because they had basically put in the justification that they should be granted pardon for not basically acting upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they were vulnerable. They basically said we were vulnerable. We couldn't travel. In other words, we were forced into doing this. That's not what we wanted to do. So that's where the malaika would reprimand them for that and say, well, wasn't the earth of the Lord Almighty spacious and vast enough for you to migrate in it? And we talked about the reasons for migrations. We said 9 reasons for migration that you could actually migrate to different places. And at the end of the day, to say that I didn't have the opportunity to travel is only for limited people. It can happen that certain people cannot travel, whether they don't have the means, they don't have the visa, they're not safe. So in that situation, they would have to at least work towards considering their religion as the priority and their children's religion as the priority, and of course, not their dunya. And this is extremely important. فَأُولَٰئِكَ مَوَاهُمْ جَهَنَّمُ وَسَاءَتْ مَصِيرًا إِلَّا الْمُسْتَضْعَفِينَ. So this basically is that exception, except the men and the women that are truly vulnerable, that are truly not having the means to travel. And of course, they don't have the, when you look at لا يستطيعون حيلة, would include not having probably the visa, not probably having the means, the money, the safety, all of that. ولا يهتدون سبيلا. And they couldn't, they tried, they did all that they can, but then لا يهتدون سبيلا. They still couldn't get to at least getting the privilege or at least getting the ability to preserve their deen. I always say, having your children sell spices. I always say this, selling spices maybe in Islamabad or probably in the streets of Lahore or whatever country, or even in Africa, and having their deen, wallahi, is a better privilege than your son being a PhD in who knows what degree and having money and all of that, and a graduate from Harvard and not having their deen. Yes, we would definitely wish that we can have somebody that has a PhD and privileged, smart, and being able to have their deen. That would definitely be at a higher status. But it's important to recognize that you as a parent, sometimes we can get carried away with wanting the dunya privilege at the expense of our deen and our kids' deen. So be careful. Even if you're getting less dunya privileges and less dunya advantages, make sure that when you get the dunya advantages, not at the expense of your children's deen and not the expense of your deen. But if you're capable of getting your dunya and deen, or your deen and dunya, well, that definitely is an advantage. That definitely is a plus. وما يهاجر في سبيل الله يجد في الأرض مراغما كثيرا وسعة وما يخرج من بيته مهاجرا إلى الله ورسوله ثم يدركه الموت فقد وقع أجره على الله. And for those, and we talked about the story of the different Sahaba, or at least they probably didn't actually get to see the Prophet ﷺ, that when they were ordered to migrate to Medina, And we said there's no migration after 8th year Hijrah, after Fath Mecca, the opening and the conquering of Mecca. So some had decided, and one of them had actually decided to still migrate, even if he was not capable of migrating, and of course died in the middle of the way. So some Sahaba questioned on whether he still gets the advantage of being the basically considered a muhajir or not. In other words, they didn't make it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala right there basically answers the question. And if a person were to migrate for the sake of the Lord Almighty and the Prophet, and then death comes to them, then the reward would basically be given to them by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. So what does that mean? Even if you didn't make it to being a scholar, you didn't make it to being a hafidha, you didn't make it to donating, you didn't make it to what you had dreamed your goal to be, just by having the intention and setting your foot on there, that actually puts you within this category. Ya salam. Even if you didn't make it, even if you didn't make it. I wanted to be a alima, but I couldn't make it. I got married. I had children. I got so busy with the children, couldn't make it. This is not talking about myself. But many sisters would tell me that. They would be wanting, it's like, I really wanted to get my ilm, but then I got married and I got the children, and of course the nursing came in and the pregnancy came in, and it just got carried away with all of that. Will I still get the reward for it? There, that answers your question, dear. This answers your questions. If you were truly sincere, and if you were truly trying to put the effort, not that, yeah, I was truly sincere, but then I basically had the sincerity, but I didn't necessarily put the step and the effort towards doing that dream of probably being an alima or probably raising my children, etc. If you, whenever you had the privilege, you set your effort to basically apply it, then in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically tells you that فَقَدْ وَقَعَ أَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Even if I didn't make it, even if you didn't make it,
And that
on a
would that be the
condition.
same? Would that be the
uh,
same for sisters who uh who couldn't have kids and they really wanted?
Absolutely, absolutely. If they really put the effort, the sincerity, and they tried, but hey, I really wanted to have a child, to have them hafal, to have them memorize the Quran, get ilm, etc. But I had this illness and I couldn't have children. So in that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَقَدْ وَقَعَ أَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give you the reward for it. Why? Because this actually goes in the generalized statement in where you basically tried, you basically put the effort, you basically had set your foot to trying. In that situation, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would be the one to give you the reward for it. All right. وَكَانَ اللَّهُ غَفُورًا رَحِيمًا. And the Lord Almighty is all merciful and all forgiving and all merciful. What's the difference between mercy and forgiveness? So mercy is wider and more comprehensive, because forgiveness is for a sin that you had committed, that it would basically be one, so disregarded, at least the implication, or even the punishment for it. But mercy, remember when, even if a sin is basically something you're not held accountable for, you still want to remember that you would enter Jannah not by the good deeds that you had done, but by the mercy of the Lord Almighty. Because the good deeds that you had done, they don't actually equal not even one blessing that you were given. Not even one blessing. Not even one blessing. Take eyesight. How much money? Let's remember Christopher Reed. Remember when he got paralyzed? He paid all the money, all that much money, just to get his basically the research, just to get his paralysis basically taken away, gone, cured. And still, he was willing to put all his money just to be able to do one thing, to walk, to walk. And that's the same thing. If you were to look at all these privileges, all the money, it's not equal to one thing. It's not equal to one privilege, that one blessing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you. So that's why we would enter Jannah with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy. وَإِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقْصُرُوا مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ إِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَن يَفْتِنَكُمُ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. And then of course, in that situation, if ضربتم في الأرض, if you were to travel, and of course ضربتم في الأرض, we said it's a compound word. ضربتم في الأرض, if you were to strike the earth, but this is a compound word. This is not a literal one. This is a metaphor to actually mean if you travel. If you travel, and then there is no sin on you to shorten from the prayer if you fear that the ladina kafaru, that the disbelievers might actually inflict al-fitna. What is al-fitna? What does that even look like? Al-fitna can mean death. Al-fitna can mean general harm. Al-fitna with a general harm could also be any type of harm. So it could be that you're afraid that if you were to stop at a gas station and actually pray there, that, especially if you're in an area that is known, or that that's an area where, a lot of the white supremacists are there, they would see you in hijab, you're parked right there, and see you praying, that might might give them maybe maybe the chance to pull your hijab off, probably, say bad words at you, or maybe even threaten you in any way. And of course, you don't want to do that. So that's a fitna. So if you fear that, oh, I might actually be at fitna here, I might have somebody, I'm predominantly in an area that's the kind of pro-Trump areas and all of that. So in that situation, you can do al-qasr min as-salah. Wait a minute. Is this a general statement when we're actually traveling? And what if we weren't afraid? And we went in details in that regard with the previous class, and we said that this in khiftum ayaftinakum alladhina kafaru is not a conditional one. So it's not a condition that only if you're afraid of some kind of an attack on you that you would shorten the prayer, but there's a general statement in where if you're on a travel, whether you feared that there would be an attack on you or some kind of a racist comment or etc., or whether there wasn't, and in other words, even if there wasn't necessarily a hardship due to travel, you could still shorten the prayer. So although you could be probably in a business class and maybe a first class or whatever, and you've got the space and they're giving you these cakes and all of that stuff, all right, but can I still shorten the prayer? I'm definitely feeling I've got all the time. Well, if you want to pray, go ahead, but it's a sunnah to shorten the prayer. And we went in details about, some scholars actually said it was obligatory, others said it was a sunnah, etc. إِنَّ الْكَافِرِينَ كَانُوا لَكُمْ عَدُوًّا مُبِينًا. For the kafirin are basically a clear and an obvious enemy. Wait a minute, why is this ayah calling al-kafirin عَدُوًّا مُبِينًا? Are they all enemies? So remember the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا ينهاكم الله على الذين لم يقاتلكم في الدين ولم يخرجكم من دياركم أن تبروهم, not تولوهم, but تبروهم. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in Surah Al-Mumtahina, that He does not forbid you or prohibit you from acting. The word is tabarruhum. Now, the word tabarruhum is different than, maybe we should go to that ayah so you could actually see it, right? Let's go to Surah Al-Mumtahina. Hopefully, we can find it really quick. What do we got right there? Al-Muzammil. Let's go beyond. Talaq. Okay, sometimes it's so hard to actually find ayat because you're actually going the other way around. And here we go. So here's this. I want you to look at this one. يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا عدوي وعدوكم أولياء تلقون إليهم بالمودة وقد كفروا بما جاءكم من الحق. So this is a general statement. O you who believe, do not take my enemy and your enemy as an authority where you would grant exchange with them mawadda, love, compassion, when they had disbelieved in what truth you had basically received, and they would expel the prophet and you out of your countries, that is. And of course, they would expel you when and why? Because you were believing in your Lord Almighty Allah. When you would go out in seeking the Lord Almighty, and of course seeking the Lord Almighty, and yet you would give them mawadda, yet you would give them and share compassion, share love, etc. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and I know what you conceal and what you reveal. And whoever does that, then they're the ones that are really deluded on their path. I want you to look at this one. Then, of course, it goes into telling us how Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam basically said, Inna bura'a'u minkum, I'm here separating, or at least I'm innocent of what you're doing. In other words, I'm not associating myself with whatever you're involved with and associate partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But here, then the ayah basically tells you, لا ينهاكم الله. This is the ayah that I was quoting, that the Lord Almighty does not forbid you from those that do not kill you. In other words, they're not acting in combat against you and against your faith, of course, and they are not expelling you from your own cities. To look at the word tabarruhum. I want you to look at this word tabarruhum. We're going to circle that word right there. Here's tabarruhum. And I'm going to circle the other word because the other word kind of sounds like it. All right, but it's actually here's that awliya, and of course tawalluhum or tawalluhum would sound somewhat similar to it. All right, so al-wala is different than right there tabarruhum. Okay, I want you to look at that one. So tabarruhum actually means to act in justice, to act kindly. That's completely different than il-wala, because il-wala would mean that you would put them in authority. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, well, no, I'm telling you here, for the people that did not fight you and they did not expel you out of your homes, it's okay to act in kindness, justice with them. And وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ. There's that emphasis, to تُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ, although the word il-bir actually includes within it il-qist, includes within it. Al-qist basically is justice. Al-bir actually includes justice. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had actually said tuqsitu ilayhim, to make sure that emphasizing on justice is important. In Allah yuhibbul muqsitin, the Lord Almighty loves those that act in justice and engage in justice. Now, this is important to keep in mind. Let's actually take this little piece away, and then إنما ينهاكم الله, emphasizing right there what it was basically asking you who to leave behind, who to basically disassociate yourselves from. And here it says إنما, and the word إنما is adatu hasr. Adatu hasr means it's basically telling you that this is exclusive to that. The Lord Almighty forbids you from basically, look at this. Here's tawallahum. Remember the word tabarruhum that we did earlier? Here we go. There's that fine line. I want you to look at it. You know what? Let me here erase it again because I want you to see these two words. Those are fine lines that many times those are that are acting activism, they confuse these two words, and those are two different pieces. Those are two different behaviors. Let's look at it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically telling us here, you can act in justice, you can act in some kindness with them, ilbir, but then that doesn't mean that you can actually do wala. Il-wala, giving them authority, is a completely different thing. In other words, to define for you Islam, to define for you ethics, to define for you what is considered as legal and not legal. You cannot actually have a kafir determining that for you, period. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says the ones that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had forbid you from basically doing wala, those that fight you in your deen and those that expel you from countries and that insist on expelling you, those are the ones you cannot do. وَمَن يَتَوَلَّهُمْ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الظَّالِمُونَ. The ones that would take them as al-wala you can never do. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, even if they basically didn't expel us, they were really, in fact, they were pro-Palestine and they were really rallying for Palestine. We saw them crying, they were hugging this, all of that. In other words, they disagree with the American policies, all of that. You can do bir, but not wala. What is the difference? Il-bir is basically acting in kindness, in where, hey, thank you for inviting me, I'm inviting them back for a dinner, etc. But when it comes to identifying religion, when it comes to identifying ethics, when it comes to seeking advice for my marriage, etc., this is a different side. This needs a Muslim lens. This needs a Muslim hierarchy. For what? For al-wahy. That's a different level. So that's why I would get a lot of people tell me, in America, polygamy is haram. I'm saying, how is that? Well, because it's illegal in America. Yeah, but no government has the power to change the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is thawabit. You can't. But I thought we were supposed to be basing we basically are supposed to be basing the rulings based on and respecting the laws of the country that we're living in. Yes, but not if they contradict the rules of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hierarchy goes to the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to the rulings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Nothing goes beyond the principles and the grounds and the boundaries that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had assigned. So no, polygamy does not become haram in America. It still is halal, but it's illegal. Those are two different things. Yes, it's illegal, but it's halal. The relationship is halal.
Can I ask a question without, I don't want you to go off topic, but
okay, fair enough.
Sorry. So my question was, is that different for if something is fard or if something is sunnah?
So whether it's fard or sunnah, it stays fard and it stays sunnah. So just because in a certain, like, let's take, for example, polygamy. All right. Is it fard? No, it's not. Absolutely not. Whoever said it was fard. It's not fard. Is it sunnah? Well, we can debate on whether what you mean by sunnah. If you mean by sunnah to mean the practice of the Prophet ﷺ and the practice of the Salihin, then yeah, they practiced it. But is it necessarily something that you would get good deeds for? Not necessarily. Why? Well, it depends on how you actually applied it. So it depends on how you applied it. If you didn't act in justice, if you could not afford
to the authority.
So if, many times people, I did actually make a video on that. Many people would think, oh, I basically want to marry a second wife because it's a sunnah. If you mean that you're going to get rewarded for marrying a second wife, that's a sunnah, that's not necessarily so accurate to understand it as. That's not because I'm a woman that I'm saying that. No, it's basically because when we're speaking about the marriage, we're speaking about marriage in general, whether it's a monogamous marriage or whether it's a polygamous marriage, it is all dependent on your capacity, your capability in basically acting based on the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in preserving the deen within the family, within yourself. And therefore,
Oh, okay. So
if
you're saying it goes back to the legal
the
maxims.
DNA, absolutely,
Okay.
the legal maxims. So if
Jazakallah.
the person was not capable of preserving their deen, or they were not capable of preserving their life, or the woman's life, or acting in justice, then in that situation, monogamous marriage is haram. If a monogamous marriage can be haram, then in that situation, let alone the polygamous marriage, it takes the same ruling. If a monogamous marriage can, in certain situations, in certain circumstances, actually be haram. Yes, getting married can be haram. Yes, getting married can be haram. When you know that
Oh
you're
yeah,
not
I see
going to
what you're
be
saying.
just,
Yeah, yeah.
of course, if you're when you know you're not going to be just with that person, you know you're going to abuse her. You know you're basically going to abuse the children. You know you have a temper issue. You know you haven't you don't have the money to feed those children. Then in that situation, it would be haram to basically expose people to injustices which you couldn't take care of. If you know that you're not going to be capable of being a good wife, for example, you know that you have an issue, then I think so many times we're just encouraging people to get married without understanding their circumstances. Some people, they just cannot get married. Some people shouldn't get married. It's a case by case thing. And that's the same thing if we're talking about monogamous marriages. That's the same thing if we're talking about polygamous marriages as well, in where it fits within that same category. If we're talking about, of course, a situation where he wants to get married to a second wife, but he doesn't have that money, or at least what we mean by money is covering also the expenses needed to make sure that we're maintaining the first family's deen, the wife's deen, his deen, etc. All of that is necessary. So anyhow, so when you're looking at this ayah, okay, that takes us into a different thing. إنما ينهاكم الله عن الذين قاتلوكم في الدين وأخرجوكم من دياركم. So now you could actually see. So الولاء is different. And I believe that the ayah we were doing was 103. There we go. وإذا كنت let's see. Let's answer the questions here. What if you wanted to travel for the sake of Allah, and while you were in the process preparing for the move, but something happened like death, sickness, etc.? Do you get the reward for wanting to move for the sake of Allah? Well, that's applying the ayah right there, my dear. This is exactly what that ayah is actually talking about. The person was preparing to move, didn't actually move yet. They sold their house. They were, putting all the different things together in order to move, but then they basically died before they're moving. فَقَدْ وَقَعَ أَجْرُهُ عَلَى اللَّهِ. Ya Rab. All right. How do you guarantee Allah's mercy? How do you guarantee Allah's mercy? Well, I mean, the Prophet ﷺ was telling us of numerous things of what guarantees Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number one, having the intention like this one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whenever He would tell you about the rahmah, that's basically a door and a place to tell you that that's something that guarantees you Allah's mercy. All right. So that's basically a place that guarantees you Allah's mercy. And not only the intention, but even putting different different steps to making that move. And it's not only that, of course, there are so many different ayat we can go into details, such as being merciful to others. If you're merciful to people, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will be merciful upon you as well. What is the formula for combining intentions? Example, sunnah fajr, sunnah entering masjid, sunnah between adhan and iqamah, 3 in 1. Is that okay? Fair enough. This is called a tashriq fi niyyah. What does that mean? Let me write that word down. This is called, let's write it down. This is called التشريك في النية. What is it, tashrik? Tashrik actually means combining more than one intention for one particular action. It's like we're doing the salah, but then I'm basically combining a couple different intentions together. So التشريك في النية in general would only be permissible if one behavior is not intended on its own. So what does that mean? Can I actually combine an intention that I am making up Ramadan and at the same time I'm basically doing the intention for an expiation for an oath that I had done? Those are two different things. There is that basically expiation fast that you were supposed to do for not having the money to pay the expiation, so you don't jump onto fasting right away like many people would think, but only if you couldn't afford to pay and couldn't afford to do the previous expiation, let's call them boundaries, limits, whatever. Okay. That you would actually go for fasting. Anyhow, so those are two different things. The expiation is kafara, and that is a different ibadah than basically the making up for Ramadan. But there are certain ibadahs that you can combine the intention. So for example, fasting Mondays and Thursdays, and at the same time having the intention to make up Ramadan. All right. Because how do we know? So the Mondays and Thursdays, that's a general timing and not necessarily a specific ibadah in where just for that. So in that situation, you can combine intention. Same thing if you were to go to the masjid, the hadith actually says when you enter the masjid, pray 2 rak'ahs. Can I have the intention that I want to do these 2 rak'ahs and also do the sunnah? You can. So how are the rewards going to be counted? Are they going to be counted multiple because I basically had several intentions in one? So kind of like a promotion. All right. Some people are basically business thinkers, right? Basically a promotion right there. So in the end is the deed is going to be considered based on the action that you had done and also the intention. All right. So the more salah that you would do, the better reward that you would get, the more reward that you would get. Because remember, the more standing, the longer recitation, the better reward. So hope I answered that question. So that's another question that the sister had sent. Oh, that was a private question. All right, well, now we know. So this is inshallah the end. I know you were like, well, wait a minute, you already did this page and you did it again. Right. So that's because we've been actually off for our Eid and of course for some time. So hopefully tomorrow's what? Tomorrow's Friday, is it? Hopefully, inshallah,
Tomorrow's
tomorrow.
Thursday.
Thursday? Okay, good. So inshallah, hopefully tomorrow we'll actually continue this page and we'll be having, inshallah, our tafsir 5 days a week and not 7 days a week. All right? Inshallah.
MashaAllah, tabarakallah. That's
Inshallah.
good. Alhamdulillah. Jazakallah.
Alhamdulillah.
Actually, we love this class. I know the other sisters, they do too, mashallah.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. So I'll go and make my husband the belated coffee.
Don't serve it cold.
Well, it's gonna be hot for sure because I'm definitely way too far.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so I have to make it. Yeah. Oops. All right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.